He told me I'd be nothing without him, and for years, I believed him. I shrank myself to fit the version of me he wanted. Quiet, small, dependent. But the night he threw those words at me again, something in me finally woke up. I walked out with nothing but a bag and a heartbeat full of fear. I never imagined that years later, he'd walk into my office, applying for a job under me. And when he saw me sitting there, everything in his face broke. If you want to know how a woman becomes everything she was never allowed to be, stay with me. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the thin glow from the stove clock. Midnight had a way of making the house feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were tired of holding up the life we pretended we lived. I stood at the sink, rinsing the last plate from dinner, moving slowly so the sound wouldn't echo too loudly. He hated noise at night. He hated anything he didn't control. He walked in without looking at me, the way he always did when he'd made up his mind about something long before telling me. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter as if he were about to give a business presentation instead of dismantling his wife. I sensed it in the quiet. Over the years, I had learned to read the air around him, the shift in temperature when he was sharpening his words. "You'll be nothing without me." He said it casually, almost gently, as if it were a fact he was doing me the kindness of reminding me of. His voice didn't rise. His face didn't twist. That was the thing about his cruelty. It never announced itself. It arrived dressed in reason, in certainty, in a tone that suggested he was simply telling me a truth I should already know. The plate slipped a little in my hands. Not enough to fall. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough for me to realize that the words hit deeper than they should have. I waited for anger to rise inside me, but nothing came. Not anger, not shock. Just a cold awareness that I had heard some version of that sentence for years. Only this time, he wasn't masking it behind jokes or concern. This time he said it plainly. He took a long sip of water, watching me as if waiting for a reaction, maybe a tear or a defensive plea. Gave him nothing. I simply turned off the faucet, dried the plate, and placed it quietly in the cupboard. He misread my silence, mistaking it for obedience, for acceptance. He let out a small, triumphant exhale and pushed off the counter. "You should remember that," he added as he walked toward the hallway. "It'll keep you grounded." Grounded. That was his word for small, for contained, for controlled. I watched his shadow disappear as he climbed the stairs. The house settled again, but something inside me did not. There was a tightness in my chest, not panic, something else. Something quiet and unfamiliar. Pulse of recognition. I stood there long after he went to bed, staring at the empty doorway. I didn't argue with him, not because I believed him, but because for the first time, I finally heard what he had been saying all along. And in that stillness, in that heavy kitchen at midnight, something shifted. Barely, silently, but enough. He thought he had spoken a prediction. But it was a beginning. In the beginning, the marriage felt like a soft place to land. He had a way of speaking with certainty that made me feel safe, as if he could hold the world steady just by deciding it should be. He opened doors, remembered small details I mentioned in passing, and made promises with a kind of confidence that made it easy to believe him. I was young enough then to mistake certainty for strength, and gentle attention for genuine respect. But marriages don't shatter in a single moment. They thin out slowly, stretched so gradually that you barely notice what's disappearing. The first cracks came disguised as jokes, little comments he made in front of friends, teasing me about how I overthought everything, or how I was cute when I tried to be smart. Everyone laughed, including him, and I forced myself to smile along. It felt easier than admitting that something inside me had tightened at the words. Later the jokes became advice. He told me which clothes looked more respectable. He suggested I avoid certain friends who didn't have ambition. He said it with warmth, with a smile, with a hand brushing my arm, as if his control was a form of love. I didn't recognize it for what it was. Not yet. I thought he was trying to shape our future, not shrink mine. Advice eventually became concern. He worried that I was taking on too much when I applied for extra training at work. He wondered if stress might get to me when I mentioned wanting a promotion. He said it kindly, almost tenderly, but something about the way he said it made me fold in on myself each time. He wasn't forbidding me outright. He was planting doubt, watering it, nurturing it, watching it grow. I began adjusting my life around his comfort without noticing when it started. I stopped mentioning opportunities because he found reasons they were unrealistic. I stopped dreaming out loud because he always found the weak spot in every dream. Soon I stopped dreaming altogether. People imagine control as shouting, slamming doors, or obvious commands. But he didn't operate that way. His power lived in the pauses between sentences, in the sigh he gave when I disagreed, in the subtle disappointment he expressed when I wanted something he hadn't approved. His silence could cut sharper than any argument. Over time I shrank, not physically, but in spirit, in presence, in the way I moved around the house as if apologizing for taking up space. His ego filled rooms effortlessly, expanding into every corner until I felt like a guest in my own life. Looking back, I can see how quietly it happened, how gently, how almost lovingly. But erosion doesn't need storms. Sometimes all it takes is a steady drip of doubt, a slow grinding away of who you once were, until you wake up one day and realize the person in the mirror is living a life built from someone else's voice. That was the marriage we had. A soft, beautiful exterior with foundations quietly crumbling underneath. I just didn't know yet how deep the cracks ran, or how close I was to finally seeing them. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that should have passed without consequence. I remember waking up with a strange lightness, a feeling that something good was about to unfold. My manager had hinted the week before that the department was expanding, and that a supervisory role might be opening. I wasn't naive enough to assume it was mine, but for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine it. A small step upward. Chance to breathe. I rehearsed possibilities in my head during my commute, imagining what it might feel like to be trusted with more responsibility. Not power, just purpose. I walked into the office with a steady calm, ready for whatever the day would bring. But by noon something felt off. Conversations quieted when I entered the break room. My manager avoided eye contact, offering only brief, polite smiles. I told myself I was overthinking it. I often believed that about myself because he had taught me to. It wasn't until later, when I went to drop off a report, that the truth slipped out. My manager thanked me for the document, and in an attempt at warmth said, "I know things must be hectic for you at home. Your husband mentioned you were overwhelmed. Please don't stress about additional responsibilities." The sentence hit like a slap I never saw coming. I stood there, holding the edge of the folder like it might anchor me to the floor. "My husband said what?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She blinked, confused by my reaction. "He stopped by last week. We spoke briefly in the lobby. He mentioned you've been struggling to manage everything. That you've had trouble balancing the house, the marriage, the job. He said he was worried a promotion might push you too far." Push me too far. She meant it kindly, but the words sliced through me. I thanked her and walked away before she could see the color drain from my face. In the restroom, staring into the mirror's fluorescent honesty, I felt something inside me shift. Not break, not collapse, but tilt. A quiet tilt that changes the view forever. He had gone out of his way to sabotage the first opportunity I'd had in years. Not because he thought I couldn't handle it, but because he feared what it would mean if I did. Control only works when the other person stays small. That evening, I drove home slowly, letting the revelation settle. I replayed his past concerns, the subtle discouragements, the whispered doubts he planted when I dared to want more. For years, I had taken his words as caution, as care. Now I saw them clearly for the first time. They were fences. When I walked through the door, he greeted me casually, as if nothing had happened. And for once, I didn't rush to meet his mood. I didn't ask about his day. I didn't shrink myself to fit the space around him. I studied him quietly instead. I watched the way he moved through the house with assumed ownership, the way he dismissed my silence without noticing its weight. He didn't know what I had learned. He didn't see the tiny shift that had begun inside me. The world hadn't fallen apart. It had simply rearranged itself, just enough for me to finally see him. She didn't go to the library looking for answers. She went because she needed air. After discovering what her husband had done, the walls of the house felt tighter, the rooms smaller, every surface carrying the echo of a life she no longer recognized. So she grabbed her keys one afternoon, told him she needed groceries, and drove until the ache in her chest softened. The library appeared almost accidentally, tucked between a bakery and a hardware store, a place she hadn't stepped into since she was a teenager. She walked in for no reason except that the quiet inside felt different from the quiet at home. Library silence held possibility. Her home held warning. The smell of old pages and dusted shelves wrapped around her like something familiar, something she hadn't realized she missed. She wandered without purpose at first, letting her fingers slide along the spines of books she didn't intend to borrow. Fiction, history, travel. Section after section of lives she wasn't living. She turned a corner and landed in the business aisle, a place she would normally ignore. Numbers, charts, strategies. None of that had belonged to her world for a long time. But one book caught her eye simply because of its title. The Psychology of Effective Leadership. The words felt foreign and magnetic at the same time. She picked it up, intending only to skim it, but the first page made her pause. It talked about influence, about communication, about self-trust, things she hadn't allowed herself to imagine in years. She read 3 paragraphs standing there in the aisle, then another 3. And then she sat down on the floor without realizing she had moved. The book didn't promise transformation, didn't preach. It simply laid out principles that made her remember something she had forgotten. She used to be capable. She used to have instincts, ideas, direction. A small warmth flickered in her chest. Not confidence, something smaller, more fragile. Spark. She checked the book out with a nervousness that surprised her, as if someone might stop her at the door and accuse her of wanting something too big. When she got home, she didn't put the book on the coffee table where he might see it. Instead, she slid it under her side of the bed, hidden like a secret she wasn't ready to defend. Every night, after he fell asleep, she pulled it out quietly and read by the dim light of her phone screen. She read about managing people, solving problems, communicating with clarity. She took notes in a small notebook she kept tucked in her purse. Her handwriting was shaky at first, as if her hands weren't used to writing for herself anymore. But as days passed, the notes grew steadier. The chapters made more sense. The spark grew warmer. She didn't tell anyone about the book. Not her coworkers, not a friend, certainly not him. This was hers, her mind stretching again, her curiosity waking up, her sense of self pushing gently against the edges of the box he had built around her. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion. There were no slammed doors or bold speeches. Just quiet pages turning in the dark, a hidden notebook filling with ideas, a woman remembering that her thoughts mattered. She didn't know it yet, but she had just taken the first step away from the life he controlled and toward the life she would eventually lead. A step so small it barely made a sound, yet it held the power to rearrange everything. She noticed the woman before she spoke to her. The retired businesswoman had one of those post-career calmnesses, the kind that came from a life lived on her own terms. She sat at the same corner table of the library every Wednesday, always with a stack of newspapers and a thermos of tea. She didn't stare, but she observed, quietly, curiously, like someone who had spent decades learning to read people long before they opened their mouths. It was on her 3rd visit that the woman finally approached. She had been scribbling notes from her leadership book, her handwriting neat but hesitant, when a soft voice interrupted. "You take notes like someone preparing for something." She startled, snapping the notebook shut as if it were contraband. The woman raised both hands gently. "I'm sorry, dear. Didn't mean to intrude. I've just seen that look before." "What look?" she asked, wary. The look of someone waking up. The words landed with an uncomfortable accuracy. She opened her notebook again, more slowly this time. "I'm just studying," she said, though the sentence felt too small for what she was actually doing. The woman smiled and took the seat across from her, uninvited but somehow welcome. "I'm Miriam," she said. "Retired now. Used to run a consulting firm." She pointed to the leadership book. "That one changed a lot of young managers in my day." "Good choice." She felt a shy warmth in her chest. "I'm not a manager. I'm just reading." Miriam studied her for a long moment. Not critically, not judgmentally, just aware. "If you're taking notes like that, you're not just reading. You're preparing." No one had spoken to her that way in years. Not as a wife, not as a helper, not as someone fragile or overwhelmed, but as someone capable, someone with potential. Before she could retreat into humility, Miriam asked the question that shook her loose from herself. "Tell me, what do you want?" She froze. The question felt as foreign as another language. Want. She hadn't been asked that in so long that she wasn't sure how to access the part of her that used to have answers. She opened her mouth, closed it again, staring at the table as heat rose up the back of her neck. "I don't know," she whispered. Miriam didn't laugh. She didn't fill the silence with advice. Instead, she nodded with a gentleness that made the admission less humiliating. "That's all right. Most women I've met didn't know at first. They only knew what they weren't allowed to want." Something inside her twitched, an ache she hadn't had words for until now. Miriam leaned in slightly. "But I'll ask you again, slowly. What do you want? Not for anyone else, not for your husband, not to keep the peace. For you." Her throat tightened. She felt the weight of years where the answer had been shaped by someone else's voice. She didn't answer, not yet, but the question lingered in the air between them like an unopened door. Miriam showed up every Wednesday after that, sometimes offering articles, sometimes recommending books, sometimes just asking questions. Not easy questions, necessary ones. Through those conversations, she began seeing pieces of herself she thought had been lost forever. Curiosity, intelligence, ambition, strength. All the things her husband had carefully, quietly eroded now re-emerged in the presence of someone who expected her to have a mind of her own. Miriam didn't push. She guided. She nudged. She opened possibilities without naming them. And week by week, the spark inside her grew brighter. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking. She was expanding, internally at first, quietly, like breath returning to lungs that had been too tight for too long. And it all began with a single question spoken softly in a quiet library. "What do you want?" He found the book on a Thursday evening, the kind of evening when the house was too quiet and tension moved through the rooms like a draft. She had placed it under the bed the night before, tucked safely between an old shoebox and a folded blanket, but she must have pushed it too close to the edge. When she came home from work, he was standing in the bedroom holding it between two fingers, as if it were something distasteful he'd fished out of the trash. "What's this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had an answer prepared. She froze in the doorway, her keys still in her hand, heart beating too fast. He flipped the book over, looking at the cover with mocking confusion. "Leadership. Project management." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't match any real amusement. She forced her voice to stay calm. "It's just something I'm reading." "Reading," he repeated, tilting his head with exaggerated pity. "For what?" "Trying to impress your little office friends." He moved closer, waving the book lightly. "You manage people. You can't even manage this house." Once, that sentence would have crushed her. It would have made her curl inward, scrambling to apologize, to fix, to shrink. She waited for the old reaction, the sting, the shame, the tears gathering behind her eyes. But nothing came. Or rather, something did come, something unfamiliar. Clarity. Clean, sudden stillness. Not anger. Not pain. Just truth. She saw him clearly, maybe for the first time, the way he needed her small so he could feel big, the way he mocked what he feared, the way he called her weakness what he himself had created. The words he threw at her didn't land in the same way anymore. They fell at her feet like broken tools, useless. He didn't notice the shift in her. He kept going, pacing a little, enjoying his own performance. "Sweetheart, you can't even keep track of the bills without me reminding you. And now you want to be some kind of manager. That's adorable." He tossed the book onto the bed as if discarding a toy. "Stick to what you're good at. It'll save you embarrassment." She didn't argue. That was the part that unsettled him most. Her silence. Not wounded silence. Not frightened silence. A silence that didn't bend. He left the room with a satisfied smirk, believing he had corrected her course. He had no idea she'd only just found it. That night, he fell asleep quickly, the way men do when they believe the world is safely shaped around them. She waited until his breathing grew deep, steady. Then she quietly reached under the bed, retrieved the book, and slipped into the living room with her notebook and a blanket. The house was dark except for the small lamp beside her. She opened the book carefully, almost reverently, like a promise she had made to herself. The words on the page felt different now, sharper, more alive, because she was reading them not in hope but in conviction. Every page she turned claimed back a piece of her mind. Every note she wrote rebuilt a fragment of the self she had lost. The clarity she felt earlier didn't fade. Grew. He thought he had stopped her. He had no idea he had just taught her exactly what she needed to know. How to lead herself out. She sent the application in during her lunch break, sitting alone in her car with the engine off and her hands trembling slightly over the screen. It wasn't even a job, just a leadership training program hosted by a local company, something meant for people who wanted to grow, to learn, to test themselves. The kind of thing she once believed was for other people. But with every late-night chapter she read, with every conversation she had with Miriam, something inside her had begun leaning forward instead of pulling back. She didn't tell him she applied. The act felt too fragile, too precious to expose to his voice. She submitted her resume, answered the questions honestly, and pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Afterward, she sat there for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She almost didn't recognize the woman looking back, someone daring to try, even quietly. A week later the email arrived. She had been accepted. The message was warm, congratulatory, outlining the start date and schedule. She read it 3 times, letting the words settle, letting herself believe they were real. For the first time in a long while, she felt something like pride bloom in her chest. That feeling lasted exactly 14 minutes, until he came home. He found her standing at the counter with the acceptance email still open on her phone. He asked what she was smiling at, and for a second she hesitated. A tiny second, but enough to remind her that fear still lived somewhere inside her. But she pushed through it. He told him. His reaction was immediate. A sharp laugh, the kind that carried no humor, only contempt. "You. A leadership program." He leaned against the counter, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to hold back more laughter. "They must be desperate." She set the phone down slowly. "They accepted me because I'm qualified." "Qualified," he repeated, amused. "Sweetheart, they'll take anyone. And even if they don't reject you halfway through, you'll quit. You always quit when things get hard." Her stomach tightened, but she didn't look away. He kept talking, dismissing the program, dismissing her, tossing out little reminders of every past failure he could think of. He painted a picture of her tripping through the classes, forgotten, lost, out of her depth. A picture he needed her to believe. But this time, his words didn't close around her like a cage. They hovered in the air, empty, powerless. Because she had already felt the spark of what it meant to say yes to herself. And once you feel that, someone else's no loses its weight. When he finally finished his monologue, she simply said, "I'm going." He stared at her, stunned not by the decision but by her tone. Steady, calm, unshakably quiet. He waited for her to falter, to soften, to apologize. He didn't. He scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. But she didn't move. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the cool surface, letting the moment sink in. She felt her spine lengthen, her breath deepen. She felt the smallest, strongest truth settle inside her. She didn't need his belief. She only needed her own. On the first day of the program, she left the house without telling him what time she'd return. She walked into the building wearing the simplest clothes she owned but carrying a quiet determination he had never seen in her. She didn't go to prove him wrong. She went to meet the version of herself he had tried to erase. The training room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers, the kind of scent that belonged to places where people expected ideas to grow. On the first day, she sat near the back, trying to make herself small, unnoticed. She kept her notebook close, her pen poised like a shield. The other participants looked confident, some chatting with ease, others scrolling through emails as if they'd been doing this their entire lives. She wondered for a moment if she was out of place. But once the session began, something unexpected happened. The instructor asked for volunteers to help organize the day's breakout groups, and before she could second-guess herself, her hand lifted. It surprised her, surprised the instructor too, but she stood, walked to the front, and helped arrange the clusters of chairs and tasks with a calm precision that felt natural. Not forced, not borrowed. The instructor gave her an approving nod. "You've done this before," he said. She hadn't. Not formally. But in that moment she realized that she had spent years managing schedules, budgets, conflicts, crises, just never for herself. As the days passed, she found abilities resurfacing like long-lost friends. When the group was given a problem-solving exercise, she instinctively took the lead, laying out ideas, organizing roles, clarifying steps. People listened. They didn't question her competence. They didn't mock her caution or misinterpret her suggestions as overthinking. They treated her contributions as valuable. By the second week, something began to shift inside her. During a discussion on communication techniques, she spoke clearly, steadily, offering insights she didn't even know she had been storing. The room went quiet, not with dismissal but with interest. The instructor smiled and wrote her point on the board. Seeing her own words in thick, bold marker sent a tremor through her chest. When she stayed behind to ask a question, he paused, studying her with genuine consideration. "You've got a strong analytical mind," he said. "Sharp instincts. Why aren't you using them more?" She didn't know how to answer. Not truthfully, at least. The real answer wasn't about opportunity. It was about permission. And she had spent years living under someone who made sure she never gave herself any. By the third week, she noticed her voice sounding different. Not louder but clearer, like it had stopped passing through layers of apology before reaching the air. Her posture changed too. She no longer bent her shoulders inward. She took notes with purpose, not fear. She asked questions without worrying they might be foolish. Each time she stepped out of the building, she felt taller. But it wasn't until one particular afternoon, after she successfully led a group through a complicated exercise, earning genuine praise, that the full weight of it hit her. She walked to her car, closed the door, and sat with her hands on the steering wheel. The quiet inside the vehicle was warm, intimate, protective. And then, without warning, tears filled her eyes. Not the tears he had trained her to shed, silent ones soaked in hurt, but a different kind entirely. Tears of recognition. Tears that came from seeing herself again after being lost for so long. She cried because she remembered the version of herself she had been before the doubt, before the erosion, before the world shrank around someone else's shadow. She cried because she was meeting that woman again, one strength at a time. When she finally drove home, her face was still damp, but her spine was straight, her breath steady. She wasn't becoming someone new. She was returning to who she had always been. The offer came in on a Thursday morning, wrapped in the polite wording of a formal email but carrying the weight of something life-changing. She had applied quietly months earlier, encouraged by her instructors and nudged by the growing belief that maybe, just maybe, her progress wasn't an accident. She didn't expect the company to call back. She didn't expect the second interview. And she certainly didn't expect the final message. "We are pleased to offer you the position of operations supervisor." She read the sentence 3 times, her breath catching each time. It wasn't a dream job. It wasn't a corner office. It wasn't glamorous. But it was real. It was hers. It was a doorway out of the life that had kept her small. She whispered the words to herself in the bathroom mirror at work, her voice shaking in a way that made her smile. "I got it." She looked at her reflection, not the unsure woman with clipped wings, but someone growing, someone steadying her own ground. For the first time she didn't second-guess. She didn't send a screenshot to him. She didn't rehearse how he might react. She clicked accept on the offer before fear could speak. That evening she came home like any other day. She cooked dinner, folded laundry, kept the household moving in its usual rhythm. She didn't rush to tell him. She didn't hide it either. She simply held the truth inside her chest like a warm stone, grounding her, strengthening her. But he found the offer email 2 days later. She had left her laptop open on the table while grabbing something from the bedroom. When she returned, he was standing over it, jaw clenched, eyes sharp, dangerously quiet. "What is this?" he asked, turning the screen toward her as if presenting evidence of a crime. "It's my new job," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Your job. Supervisor." He let out a bitter scoff, shaking his head. "You applied without asking me. Without talking to me. Without considering how this affects this house." She didn't answer immediately. She watched him pace, watched the disbelief turn into insult, the insult into rage. His voice rose, accusing her of selfishness, foolishness, disloyalty. He threw out all the old lines. How she couldn't handle responsibility, how she'd embarrass herself, how she'd fail and make them both look bad. He demanded she decline the offer. He insisted she apologize. The old version of her might have. She might have rushed to soothe him, to make herself small enough to fit the shape he wanted her to be. But not now. She stood there, completely still, letting his shouting wash over her without sinking in. And when he finally stopped, breath heaving, waiting for her to crumble, she simply said the sentence that ended something between them. "I start Monday." He blinked, stunned, because it wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't emotional. It was final. He demanded explanations. She offered none. He waited for tears. None came. He wanted her to beg for forgiveness. He didn't. She sat down, calmly continued her evening, and left him standing in the doorway, bewildered by the sudden realization that he no longer had control over her. That night, he slept facing the wall, angry and restless. She lay awake beside him, but for once, her mind was not filled with fear or doubt. It was filled with something new. Freedom, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and steady, like the first breath after being underwater too long. Monday couldn't come soon enough. The change began quietly, the same way his control once did. At first, he didn't rage or argue. He watched. He watched her leave in the mornings with purpose instead of apology. He watched her come home later than before, her steps steady, her eyes clearer. He watched her sit at the table in the evenings reading work documents, highlighting lines, writing notes. He watched her become someone he no longer recognized, someone no longer shaped by his approval. Jealousy doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it creeps in through small comments meant to claw at confidence. He started with those. "You're really full of yourself lately," he said one night while she poured herself tea. She didn't respond. "All this confidence," he added, making the word sound like a flaw. Another evening, as she walked through the door after her shift, he demanded, "Who were you really with?" She blinked, confused. "At work," she said plainly. He scoffed. "You expect me to believe you're suddenly staying late for work? Since when do you matter that much to anyone?" She didn't rise to it. She didn't defend herself. She simply hung up her coat, the silence between them heavier than any argument. The more confident she became at her job, the more unstable he grew at home. It was as if every ounce of happiness she gained cost him something he wasn't willing to lose. He began measuring everything she did as if it were evidence of betrayal. If she wore nicer clothes, he said she was dressing for another man. If she stayed up late refining reports, he said she was neglecting the house. If she smiled after a good meeting, he accused her of acting too good for him. "It's like you think you're better than everyone now," he snapped one night as she quietly folded laundry. "I don't think that," she said softly, but he didn't hear her. He only heard the sound of his own shrinking importance. He tried to pull her back into the old patterns. He created chaos where there was none, picking fights before she left for work so she would carry guilt through the day. He questioned every detail of her schedule. He tried to make her success feel like a threat instead of an achievement. Their home, once ruled by his quiet authority, turned into a battlefield he kept losing ground on. But something had changed within her. She no longer accepted his moods as her responsibility. She no longer felt the need to argue or explain herself into being understood. She no longer bent. She simply observed him, really observed him, for the first time. And what she saw was not strength, not power, not superiority. He was small. Small in his insecurities. Small in his need to be bigger than her. Small in the way he mistook control for love. Small in the way he feared her growth because it exposed his own stagnation. One night, after accusing her yet again of things she had never done, he asked, "Why are you looking at me like that?" She didn't answer. She just looked at him quietly, realizing that the man she once thought was strong had never been strong at all. He had only been louder. And for the first time, his noise no longer drowned out her clarity. It happened late on a Sunday evening, the kind of night when most houses softened into quiet routines. But their home had long stopped being a place of peace. The argument began the way most arguments did now. Over nothing. A dish left to dry, a meeting she forgot to mention, the way she didn't immediately answer a question. He had been looking for a spark, something small to ignite into a fire big enough to scorch her confidence again. She felt it the moment she walked through the door. He followed her from room to room, building momentum, repeating accusations she no longer tried to correct. She set her bag down, took off her shoes, moved through the kitchen, and all the while he trailed behind, throwing words like stones meant to bruise. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lower it either. She just stopped responding. And that enraged him more than any argument could have. Finally, he cornered her in the hallway. His face twisted with a desperation she recognized too well. "You're nothing without me," he spat, the same sentence he had once said with calm certainty but now delivered with frantic force. "You'll be nothing without me." This time, something inside her didn't crack. It didn't shake. It settled. His words, once heavy enough to anchor her to the life he built, now sounded thin, like a threat spoken through paper. She looked at him and saw not a man holding power, but a man afraid of losing it. She didn't scream. There was no dramatic moment, no slamming doors or thrown objects. She simply inhaled, exhaled, and felt a strange quiet bloom inside her chest. Without answering him, she walked past him into their bedroom. He followed, still talking, still trying to fill the silence with his voice, but she didn't hear him anymore. She took a small duffel bag from the closet. She folded clothes. Not many, just enough for a week. She gathered her documents. Birth certificate, social security card, bank statements, the certificate from her training program. She placed them neatly inside a folder. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath didn't rush. Everything she did felt steady, inevitable. He didn't realize what she was doing until she zipped the bag. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, grabbing her arm. She gently pulled away. "Don't walk out that door," he warned, but there was something hollow in his voice now. She slipped on her shoes, picked up the bag and walked past him. He kept shouting behind her, a storm she no longer needed to survive. She stepped outside into the night air, cool and sharp, and for the first time in years, she felt her lungs expand fully. The room she found was small. A single bed, peeling paint, a window stuck halfway open. She could barely afford it, the rent swallowing more than she earned. But when she set her bag down and sat on the edge of the mattress, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. Real breathable air. The silence in the room wasn't heavy or punishing. It was her own. She lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, and let the truth settle into her bones. She had walked out. She had done the one thing he believed she could never do. And in that tiny rented room, she didn't feel nothing. She felt free. She didn't plan to end up in a tech firm. She had walked out with nothing but a duffel bag and a thin strand of courage, not a roadmap. Most of those early weeks in the rented room were filled with uncertainty. Tight budgets, sleepless nights, cheap dinners, and an unfamiliar quiet that sometimes felt like freedom and sometimes felt like loneliness. But she kept showing up to work, kept learning, kept applying for better roles with a persistence she hadn't known she possessed. And eventually, one interview shifted everything. The company was newer, expanding quickly, with energy that crackled through the hallways like static. During the interview, she surprised herself. She spoke clearly, confidently, drawing from the leadership training she'd once taken in secret. She talked about problem-solving, organizing workflows, communicating under pressure. The woman interviewing her, a sharp-eyed director with a calm demeanor, leaned back in her chair and said, "You sound like someone who's been doing this for years." She hadn't. But life had trained her differently, in harder ways. She received the job offer within 2 days. From the moment she stepped into the office, something within her clicked into place. There was no one hovering over her shoulder, no voice muttering doubts, no one reminding her of who she wasn't allowed to be. She worked quietly but with focus, absorbing everything: software systems, communication processes, team dynamics. Her mind, once used to shrinking, now expanded quickly. She volunteered for tasks others avoided. She noticed gaps in workflows and filled them before anyone asked. She organized meetings with a calm efficiency that earned nods from people who had been there longer. It wasn't loud success. It was steady, relentless. Her mentor, Miriam, remained part of her life, sometimes in person at the library, sometimes through long phone calls in the evenings. Miriam guided her not by telling her what to do, but by teaching her how to see her own choices clearly. "You belong in every room you walk into," she said once, and she carried those words into each morning. Before long, her supervisors noticed her consistency. They noticed her clarity under stress, her ability to make things make sense. When they expanded the operations team, she was the first name they discussed. She moved up again. Subtle promotions that felt like stepping stones laid out just in front of her feet. She didn't celebrate publicly. She celebrated quietly, privately, in the way she breathed easier and slept sounder. Her confidence didn't return all at once. It rebuilt itself slowly, like a muscle strengthening after years of disuse. People began coming to her for guidance, for answers, for direction. She found herself speaking more in meetings, her voice even and assured. She found herself trusted, respected, and without meaning to, she began shaping a new life, one built on her choices, her work, her growth. Her apartment grew a little larger. Her savings became less fragile. She bought a second-hand desk and placed it by the window, where sunlight warmed the pages of her notes each morning. She didn't think of him much, not in grief, not in longing, not even in anger. He simply faded, becoming smaller in her mind the further she grew. The life he said she couldn't build was forming piece by piece, quietly and steadily, like dawn creeping across a dark landscape. He had never imagined she could rise. But she wasn't rising for him to see. She was rising because she finally saw herself. The years had a way of reshaping everything. Her routines, her posture, even the rhythm of her breath. She didn't notice the transformation at first. It happened slowly, the same way erosion once took pieces of her. But this time it was the reverse. Her confidence layered itself back brick by brick until she stood on ground she had built herself. By the time she was promoted to director, her life felt like an entirely different landscape. She had a window office with a view of the city, a team who trusted her judgment, and a name that circulated in meetings with respect rather than doubt. She kept her leadership steady, quiet, and measured. She listened more than she spoke. She prepared more than she boasted. She remembered every person who had helped her up and none of the ones who tried to knock her down. She didn't lead to prove anything. She led to create spaces she once needed. One afternoon, she sat at her desk reviewing a set of resumes for a new supervisory role. The company was expanding again, and she was responsible for selecting candidates to interview. It was a routine task, something she had done dozens of times, scanning through qualifications, experience, and cover letters with a practiced eye. Halfway down the list she stopped. Her breath stilled, not sharply, not in panic, but in recognition. A familiar name stared back at her, printed neatly in bold letters. The same handwriting she used to see on envelopes, the same signature she once forged on household documents because he didn't care to do it himself. Her ex-husband. For a moment, the room seemed quieter, the world narrowing to a single line of text. She expected her old self to rise inside her, to shrink, to tremble, to look for an escape route. But none of that happened. Instead, she simply sat back in her chair, letting the surprise settle in before opening his resume. He wasn't doing as well as he used to claim he would. Several job changes in short periods. A tone in his cover letter that sounded pressured, almost desperate. His references were thin, his skills outdated. He was no longer a man who could stand on arrogance alone. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. Only a quiet, steady clarity. She did not skip his name. She did not delete the application. She did not reject him out of spite or fear. She clicked the checkbox beside his name and selected Schedule Interview. The assistant coordinating the interviews poked her head in minutes later, asking if she wanted to approve the full list. She nodded. Including all of them, she said, her voice even. All of them. Yes, she repeated. When she was alone again, she looked out across the skyline visible from her office window. The city moved as it always did. Cars threading through streets, buildings humming with life, people going places she once believed she would never reach. She wasn't scheduling the interview to prove anything. She wasn't doing it to punish him. She was doing it because she had built her position through fairness, through competence, through the belief that everyone earned a chance to speak for themselves. And because she was no longer the woman he once controlled. When the calendar notification later popped up with his name beside a date and time, she felt nothing but calm resolve. She was ready to sit across from him, not as his wife, not as his shadow, but as the person he once insisted she could never become. He arrived 7 minutes early, something she noted through the small glass panel beside the meeting room door. He had always been punctual when he believed it mattered, when he wanted to impress, when he wanted the world to see him as competent and in control. She watched his silhouette shift outside the room, straightening his jacket, adjusting his tie, rolling his shoulders the way he used to before speaking to anyone he thought was beneath him. He didn't know who he'd be meeting. The interview notice had listed a generic leadership panel. He expected an audience, a group he could charm or intimidate. He expected to lead the dynamic the way he always had. He didn't expect her. When he finally pushed the door open, he stepped inside with a rehearsed half-smile. It froze the second he saw her sitting at the table, calm, composed, hands folded, posture steady. The smile collapsed so quickly it looked like a muscle giving out. For a moment he didn't breathe. Then he blinked hard, as if trying to make the image reorganize itself into someone else. Anyone else? You, he said, the word barely formed. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. Please have a seat. The authority in her tone knocked the ground out from under him. He hesitated before sitting, as if unsure whether the furniture still belonged to his version of reality. She watched him struggle to find a place to put his hands. She noticed the way his jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffening as he tried to gather whatever was left of the confidence he'd once used like a weapon. He opened his mouth twice before any sound left it. I didn't know you worked here. You didn't ask, she replied softly. He swallowed, staring at her with a mix of disbelief and something else she instantly recognized: fear. Not fear of her, but fear of being seen. Really seen. Without the armor of superiority he had worn their entire marriage. She began the interview the same way she began every interview. Asking about his experience, his skills, his goals. Her voice remained steady, neutral, professional. He answered, but the man she once knew, the one who spoke with grandiosity and certainty, was gone. His voice wavered. He tripped over dates. He avoided her eyes. Every question exposed the life he had built on assumptions about his own greatness. At one point he paused and whispered, "I didn't think you'd ever get this far." She didn't smile. She didn't show anger. She let a gentle silence sit between them, a silence shaped by years of truths unspoken. Finally, she folded her hands and said the words he once believed she would never have the strength to say. "You were wrong. I became everything you said I couldn't." The sentence hung in the air, calm, steady, undeniable. He looked down, his throat tightening. There was no arrogance left, no lingering smirk, no dismissal or condescension. Just a man sitting in front of the person he had underestimated more than anyone else. She didn't berate him. She didn't list his past cruelties. She didn't repay what he had done to her. She simply held the truth in place long enough for him to see it clearly. When the interview ended, she thanked him professionally and stood. He remained seated for a moment, dazed, as if the chair itself refused to release him back into the world he knew before walking into that room. As he finally rose and walked toward the door, he paused and looked back, not with anger, but with a grief she had no responsibility to heal. She met his gaze with the quiet strength she had earned on her own. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had become someone he was never capable of imagining. She reviewed his file one last time after he left the room, but there was no internal debate. He wasn't the right fit. Not for the role, not for the team culture, not for the environment she had spent years building with intention. She completed the evaluation form with the same fairness she offered every candidate. No harshness. No retaliation hidden between the lines. Just an honest assessment. When she reached the final box asking whether she recommended him for the position, she selected no. Her hand didn't shake. Her heart didn't rush. Felt like choosing truth, nothing more. Later that afternoon, she asked her assistant to send the standard rejection email. She gave no special instructions. She didn't need to. She had learned that power didn't require dramatics. Sometimes it lived in quiet choices made with a clear mind. But before she closed his file, she paused, not out of regret, but out of reflection. She didn't hate him. She didn't wish him failure. In a strange way, she wished him clarity, growth, maybe even the chance to become something other than the man who once tried to shrink her. Not for him, but because she understood the weight of transformation. She understood what it meant to rebuild from the ground up. And she understood that some lessons only come when you're forced to face yourself. She whispered, almost to herself, "I hope you find what you need." There was no yearning in the sentence, no softness directed toward the past. It was simply a release. As the workday neared its end, she walked to the large window in her office. The sky outside had begun its shift into evening, the city slowly glowing with its thousands of small lights. Cars moved along the streets like quiet streams of intention. Buildings towered and softened under the pink-gray sky. It all felt distant and strangely comforting. She rested her hands gently on the window frame, feeling the coolness of the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, older, steadier, unmistakably her own. There was a time she wouldn't have recognized the woman looking back. A time she would have looked for permission, for proof, for someone else to validate her place in the world. But now she saw only the result of choices she had made piece by piece, even when she felt fragile. Especially when she felt fragile. Freedom didn't crash into her life. It didn't arrive with trumpets or roaring triumph. It crept in gradually, settling quietly into her bones until she realized she no longer flinched at shadows that once owned her. She felt the distance between who she had been and who she was now. Vast, steady, undeniable. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the city's hum blend into the stillness inside her. Not triumphant, not victorious, just free. Quietly, fully, finally free.